Hi and welcome. I thought I'd give a bit of a winter update since nothing much has been happening on my channel for the last couple of months. We're in the middle of major renovations here, so I haven't had a bathroom or a kitchen, and there's tradesmen around most days during the week, which has really put a bit of a cramp into doing the odd review in the garage or a test ride of a bike and doing the piece to camera out front here because of all the vehicles we've had in the driveway, plus all the noise that's been going on. Plus it's also been quite cold being the middle of winter here, so it hasn't actually been conducive to wanting to go out for a ride anyway. But I thought I'd just give you a bit of an update, and I'll just go around the bikes. We'll start off with my Gilera Saturno 350, and the major thing that I've done to this is I've given it a new set of tyres. The original Michelin M1s were 11 years old, and whilst they were pretty much brand new from a tread point of view, they weren't particularly confidence inspiring. I think the compound had gone quite hard. I even managed to spin up the rear wheel in a straight line on it on a dry day while overtaking over a white line, and considering the bike only has around 33 horsepower, that really does give you an indication that perhaps it was time for those tyres to be retired. Now I've replaced them with a pair of Michelin Power RSs, which are Michelin's top sporting tyres. Probably a bit of an overkill for this bike considering its horsepower and weight, but I'm really pleased with the result. It sort of has improved the handling of the motorcycle from the point of view that the motorcycle really changes direction much easier now with these new tyres on. One other thing that has changed though is that I've reduced the size of the rear tyre back to the factory recommended size. The rear on it was a slightly larger tyre, and that probably also affected the handling a little bit. One of the reasons I could fit the Michelins on here was that the Gilera, even though it's a 1988 model, is fitted with 17-inch rims that are the same size as many modern smaller motorcycles. So it was actually I had quite a choice of tyres available to me. A few other things that I've done to this bike. After coming back from a ride in very cold weather a couple of weeks ago, I noticed that the taillight was hanging off. And the base has a couple of little metal tabs that slide on that the bolts go into from the back, and they'd broken off over the 30 years of life of the taillight. One had obviously broken some time back and had been repaired with some silicone, and the other one broke on that ride. Fortunately, I managed to repair the taillight base by machining up a couple of little L brackets, which I bolted in there, and the taillight's good for another few years yet. That particular taillight is rather hard to find, so that was a good solution to that. One of the other issues I had was that the pin that holds the pads in for the rear caliper had disappeared sometime down the track. So the pads were only being held in by the little plastic cover, which is a bit of a freaky moment, but then again, the rear brake doesn't actually do that much. It's not quite like losing your front brake, or the potential of losing your front brake. Fortunately, I found a pin from a Moto Guzzi caliper that was close, and I drilled that to fit a clip, and that problem was also solved. Now, I also recently had to just fix a wiring harness problem. I noticed that when I went to right hard lock that the oil light would come on when the engine was running. And I traced that back to a wire that was rubbed through just behind the instrument cluster here, which I neatly fixed up. And while I was there, I tidied up the wiring for the indicators a little bit as well. Now the one remaining problem that I've got is really there is a small oil leak, which I think is actually coming from the seal around the countershaft sprocket. But it's rather hard to determine. It could just be the drain plug crush washer that's leaking. This sort of oil appears in that area, and it's a bit indeterminate as to where it is. So I'll probably change that crush washer at the next oil change, and if the leak persists, it looks like I'll probably have to change that oil seal that's behind the front sprocket there. Apart from that, I'm really getting used to the handling of this bike. I mean, it's such a lightweight motorcycle and is so different to my other two bikes, I was actually feeling a little bit intimidated by it early on, but I'm really starting to relax and get into the limitations and the capabilities of this motorcycle through the corners, tight, and also the sweepers, and I'm really starting to enjoy it, apart from the fact that I do find I can't ride it more than, say, 100 kilometres in a session, because I'm bent up fairly tight in this racer's crouch, and I find, of all things, that the bottom of my feet have a tendency to go numb on long rides. You would have thought that the thin padding on the seat would have been the major contributor to fatigue, but strangely enough, it's my feet. Go figure, which is rather unusual. Well, let's move on to the Moto Guzzi Le Mans. My Mark V Le Mans, it's still waiting for the valve guides to be done. Yes, I know I was going to do it this winter, but I just haven't got around to it yet. Apart from that, I've had no major issues with it. I've just been enjoying riding it. And I must admit, moving from the Gilera to the Le Mans, it's really chalk and cheese. The Moto Guzzi really is certainly, from a handling point of view, a much older design that has its roots in the really the late 1960s. One problem I have had has been with the starter motor not engaging properly. It spins up fine, but intermittently it doesn't engage properly, and you have to attempt to start the bike a few times before the starter engages. I've disassembled that starter motor and haven't found anything obviously wrong in there. I might have to give it to an auto electrician or someone who knows a little bit more about Moto Guzzi starter motors than me, but you know, I'll get to the root of that problem eventually. So that's the Mark V Le Mans, nothing really happening there. Now my Benelli TNT, I've fitted a Michelin Power RS tyre to the rear. The front tyre was still good. And I certainly noticed the difference more so on that bike in many respects. It really does grip much better than the previous generation of Michelin sports tyres. There's just it just gives you a feeling that it could really punch you through a brick wall with the amount of grip that it's got on the back there. If anything, the rear probably has better grip than the front, considering the front is the previous generation Michelin, which I think is a Pilot 4 from memory. Now, I've had a couple of minor issues with the TNT, nothing really serious. I had a coolant leak, which was just a weeping from one of the return hoses on the left-hand side down near the water pump, and that just came, I'd say, from shrinkage of the hose. The hose clips on the TNT are those ones that require a special tool to be clipped on, which I don't have, so I replaced it with a small stainless steel standard style hose clip with the screw clamp on them, and that solved that problem. One of the other issues I had about 6 months ago was an electrical fault where the bike would cut out on a ride. It started doing it intermittently, and then it just got a little bit worse and worse, and I finally tracked it down to the starter solenoid. There's the main fuse for the electrical system is on the starter solenoid. Now, I'd replaced that starter solenoid a few years ago with a cheap Chinese knockoff one because that's all I could get at the time. But the actual fuses that were supplied, the fuse, the 30 amp fuse, had actually melted slightly and was causing, probably from arcing and a dirty contact there, it got hot and the fuse body had started to melt. So I cleaned up the contacts, replaced the fuse, and I haven't had another issue with that since. Now, my wife's motorcycle, her 750 Breva, has a small oil leak somewhere underneath the engine. Personally, I think it's coming from one of the breather tubes that goes from the sump up to the breather box, which is part of the airbox assembly. But apart from that, that Breva just seems to be indestructible. It just keeps on going, and really, I'm quite amazed at how long-lived that Moto Guzzi is. It's probably up to 125, 126,000 kilometres now. Of course, we can't be really sure, because when the odometer got to 9999, it just froze, and that's a common problem with the odometers on the Brevas and Nevadas of that era. Well, certainly the ones that had that particular dash. The odometer just wouldn't clock over, it just stops there. Well, for the future, I certainly want to have a look at the new Honda monkey bike that's come out, and there's a whole range of other interesting motorcycles. The new Royal Enfield 650 Twin will be out later this year, and that's certainly going to be well worth having a look at. And there'll be a few other interesting second-hand bikes around that I'm sure that will be worth checking out and doing a review on. Hopefully these renovations will be over in the next month or month and a half. Who can tell? But I think that covers it for the moment, and I guess I'll see you next time.